October 20th, 1942, somewhere in the Western Desert, North Africa. The desert was endless, the horizon shimmered in waves of gold and white heat, and the sun, merciless, unblinking, hung above like a burning coin. The truck coughed, sputtered, and finally died. Its engine gave a last, choking sound before falling silent. Dust hung in the air for a moment, then settled slowly over the cracked earth. Inside the cab, Private Joe Harlan slapped the steering wheel in frustration. "That's it. She's gone." From the back, Sergeant Cole growled, "You said she'd make it to the next checkpoint." Harlan wiped the sweat from his forehead. "I said I hoped she would. Hope ain't the same as a promise, Sarge." Cole climbed down from the truck, his boots crunching on the dry sand. He shaded his eyes and looked across the empty expanse. "Hope won't get us back to Alamein." There were 6 of them, a small squad of American infantrymen attached to the British 8th Army. They had been assigned to escort a supply convoy, but a sandstorm had blown through the night before, scattering the vehicles and leaving them stranded somewhere in the middle of nowhere. Along with them was Lieutenant Frank Mason, a weary cartographer who looked more like a schoolteacher than a soldier. His maps, folded and faded, were strapped inside a leather case that never left his side. He climbed out of the passenger seat now, pulling his compass from his pocket. "We're off course," he said quietly. Cole turned. "You think?" Mason ignored the sarcasm and pointed east. "If we keep moving that way, we'll hit the ridgeline by sundown. There's a pass there. I saw it marked once on an old Italian survey. Might be a shortcut back to the main road." Harlan frowned. "A shortcut through that?" He pointed toward the distant haze of mountains rising like jagged teeth. "Better than waiting here to cook," Mason replied. Cole thought for a moment, then nodded. "All right, grab your packs, we move." The sun climbed higher as the men trudged across the desert. The sand was soft, their boots sinking with every step. Their canteens were half empty. Mason walked ahead, checking his compass every few minutes. Behind him, the squad moved in silence, their faces streaked with dust and exhaustion. After hours of walking, the land began to rise. The flat desert gave way to rocky hills and narrow gullies. The air grew cooler as the sun dipped lower, and long shadows stretched across the sand. By the time they reached the base of the mountains, the light was fading into a deep red glow. Cole called for a halt. "We camp here tonight. Mason, you and Harlan check the ridge in the morning." The men dropped their packs, grateful to rest. The desert wind whistled through the rocks, carrying with it a faint smell of oil and metal, unfamiliar in the stillness. Mason noticed it first. "Do you smell that?" he asked quietly. Harlan sniffed the air. "Yeah, like machinery." They exchanged a look, then climbed a nearby slope to get a better view. When they reached the top, Mason raised his binoculars. What he saw made his heart race. Down below, in a narrow valley between the ridges, a small German encampment sat tucked against the rocks. 3 trucks, a radio tent, and a handful of soldiers milling about. Harlan whispered, "Looks like a supply post." Mason's voice was low. "Or a lookout station, and that pass." He pointed beyond the camp to a narrow trail winding through the hills. "That's the one I saw on the old map. If that's open, it leads straight behind Rommel's front line." Harlan's eyes widened. "You mean—" "I mean, we just found the back door to Alamein." They hurried back down to camp. When Mason told Cole what they'd seen, the sergeant's first reaction was disbelief. "You're saying this little path could turn the whole battle?" Mason spread his map on the ground. "The British think this ridge is impassable, but it's not. That pass connects directly to the German rear supply routes. If our side hits them from here, we could cut off half their tanks before they know what's happening. He had spent most of his life behind a drafting table, measuring lines and angles, but now those lines had led him here, to a place where his knowledge might actually change the course of a war. He thought about the men sleeping beside him, ordinary soldiers, misfits, stragglers, and yet somehow fate had placed them on the edge of something enormous. Before dawn they set out again. The sky turned from black to violet to pale gold as they climbed the ridge overlooking the pass. Below them, the German camp still slept. Cole crouched beside Mason. "We can't risk a firefight," he whispered. "Too many of them." Mason nodded. "We don't need to fight. We just need to mark the location and move." Harlan crouched nearby, pulled out his rifle. "Still, I'd feel better knowing they're not following us." As the first rays of sunlight touched the rocks, the squad moved silently along the upper slope. Mason took bearings with his compass, sketching quick notations on his map. Halfway across, one of the men stumbled on loose gravel. The sound of falling stones echoed down the valley. German voices shouted below. "Go!" Cole hissed. "Move!" Bullets cracked through the air. The squad scrambled upward, diving behind boulders. Dust flew around them as the Germans opened fire. Mason clutched his map case tightly, crawling through the dirt. Harlan fired back a few rounds to slow the pursuit. Cole shouted, "Keep going! Get that map out of here!" They climbed higher, the shots fading as they reached the ridge's far side. By the time they stopped, breathless and shaken, the camp below was out of sight. Mason pulled open his map. His hands trembled, but his markings were clear. The pass, the bearings, the coordinates, everything they needed. Cole looked at him and said quietly, "If that's right, this could change everything." Mason nodded. "Then we'd better make sure it gets home." The sun rose fully, flooding the mountains with light. The squad turned west, beginning the long, dangerous trek back toward Allied lines. Behind them, in the hidden valley, the Germans had no idea that 6 lost men had just discovered the secret that could end their campaign. And as the desert wind carried the heat of the coming day, the map in Mason's hands became more than just paper. It was the key to a victory no one yet believed was possible. Narrators closing lines. In war, heroes are not always the ones who charge forward. Sometimes they're the ones who get lost, who stumble upon history by accident, and who find, in the middle of nowhere, the path that leads the world home. October 24, 1942, the edge of the Katara Depression, North Africa. The desert was silent again, except for the sound of boots crunching over hard sand. The sun had not yet climbed above the horizon, but already the air shimmered with heat. 6 men moved carefully through the half-light, dusty, tired, and determined. Ahead of them, Lieutenant Mason walked with the map case pressed tightly to his chest. Behind him, Sergeant Cole led the others, scanning the horizon for movement. They were deep behind enemy lines, with miles of open desert between them and safety. But they had something that could change the course of the war. Coordinates of a secret mountain pass that would allow the Allied forces to strike the German army from behind. By midday, the sun was merciless. Private Harlan stumbled, swearing under his breath, "If this heat doesn't kill us, the thirst will." Cole tossed him his half-empty canteen. "Sip it, not gulp. We'll find water soon." "Soon," Harlan muttered. "That's what you said yesterday." Mason stopped ahead of them and raised his binoculars. "There's a wadi ahead," he said. "Dry riverbed, maybe shade." The men quickened their pace. Within half an hour, they reached the shallow ravine. The sand gave way to rough stone, and low shrubs clung to the edges. It wasn't much, but it was enough to rest. They huddled in the shadow of a boulder. For the first time that day, the heat eased off their backs. Cole sat beside Mason. "You sure about those coordinates?" Mason unrolled the map. Positive. The pass is narrow, but it's real. If Montgomery gets this information, he can move an entire brigade through there undetected. Cole looked at him. You sound like you've done this before. Mason smiled faintly. I used to draw maps for the Royal Engineers before America joined the war. I never thought I'd be living inside one of them. As they rested, a low droning sound broke the stillness. The men froze. Cole motioned for silence. Aircraft, he whispered. They ducked under the overhang as a German reconnaissance plane passed overhead, its shadow gliding across the sand. The sound faded, but Mason's heart pounded in his chest. If they're sweeping this area, Cole said grimly, they know we're here. Mason checked his compass. Then we move at night. That evening, under a sky filled with stars, they marched again. The moonlight painted the desert silver, and their shadows stretched long and thin across the ground. The map led them toward the mountains, dark shapes rising against the horizon. The closer they came, the colder the air became. Looks like ghosts up there, Private Nash, the youngest of the group, murmured. Whole place gives me the creeps. Cole grunted. That's why no one comes this way. Nature's doing half the fighting for us. As they climbed higher, the wind picked up, howling through the rocks like distant voices. The pass was ahead, narrow, twisting, almost invisible from the open desert. Mason knelt and examined the ground. There were tire tracks, faint but recent. German patrols, he whispered. Cole crouched beside him. They're guarding the pass. Maybe not guarding, Mason replied. Maybe just scouting. But it means they don't think anyone could use this route. That's our advantage. Cole nodded slowly. Then let's keep it that way. They set up a small observation point behind a ridge. Through his binoculars, Mason could see the entire valley below, a narrow trail winding between cliffs, and at the far end, the faint glow of a German outpost. He traced the route on his map. If Montgomery sends a flanking force through here, they could hit Rommel's supply lines within hours. Harlan, lying beside him, squinted through the scope of his rifle. Only problem is, we're still stuck on this side, Cole said quietly. We'll move at dawn, slip through before the next patrol. We just need to avoid drawing fire. The desert grew colder that night. The men shared what little rations they had left, hard biscuits and a single can of beans. Harlan stared into the darkness. You ever think about how weird this is? Us, Americans, wandering around the desert, lost, trying to save the British? Cole smirked. I try not to think too hard about it. Mason chuckled softly. War makes strange partners. Doesn't matter what flag's on your shoulder. Out here, we're all just trying to get home. The laughter faded, replaced by the quiet sound of wind moving through stone. Before dawn, they broke camp and began their descent toward the pass. The trail was narrow, the ground loose. Rocks shifted under their boots. Mason led carefully, marking each bend with quick notes on his map. Then a shout echoed from below. German voices. The men dropped flat. Through the morning haze, Mason saw 2 trucks parked near the pass entrance, headlights dim. A squad of soldiers was unloading crates. Cole whispered, "Looks like a supply run." Harlan adjusted his rifle. "We could take them?" Cole shook his head. "No gunfire. We're not here to fight, just to get through." Mason studied the map. "There's another path, a ravine that runs parallel to the pass. It's rough, but it comes out behind that outpost." Cole nodded. "Show me." They crept through the ravine, hugging the shadows. The sun was climbing, but the cliffs kept them hidden. At one point, the ground gave way beneath Nash, sending a cascade of pebbles tumbling down. Everyone froze. The Germans didn't hear, they moved on. After an hour of tense climbing, they reached the far end. From here, they could see the pass stretching north, a natural corridor cutting through the mountains. Beyond it, faint in the distance, was the endless flat of the desert floor leading toward El Alamein. Mason's breath caught. That's it. That's the route. Cole looked through his binoculars. If we can see it, we can mark it. Then we get the hell out of here. Mason knelt, carefully sketching the final details, every rock, every curve, every outpost. The map was now complete, a perfect record of a road that wasn't supposed to exist. As they prepared to move, a sudden burst of machine gun fire echoed from the valley below. German patrols. They'd been spotted. "Run!" Cole shouted. The men sprinted along the ridge, bullets snapping past them. Dust and rock exploded at their feet. Mason stumbled, but kept his grip on the map case. Harlan turned and fired a few shots to cover him. Cole yelled, "Keep moving! Don't stop!" They dove into the ravine, sliding down loose gravel until they hit the flat below. Mason scrambled to his feet, lungs burning. "Everyone here?" he gasped. Cole nodded, counting quickly. "All 6! Move!" They ran through the twisting gullies until the gunfire faded behind them. Only when the sun was high did they finally stop. They collapsed in the shade of a large rock. The air was silent, except for their ragged breathing. Mason pulled out the map. It was smudged with dirt and sweat, but intact. He looked at Cole. "We did it." Cole managed a tired grin. "Now let's just make sure it counts." Narrator's closing lines. In the desert, every step can be a gamble, life or death decided by direction. But for one small squad, a lost road and a hand-drawn map had become something more, a thread of hope stretched across miles of sand, guiding an entire army toward victory. October 22, 1942, the desert beyond the pass, North Africa. The morning after their escape, the desert felt heavier, not just from the heat, but from the silence that followed. The 6 men stood on a ridge overlooking miles of endless dunes. The pass they had discovered lay behind them, hidden by the mountains. Ahead, somewhere far beyond the horizon, was friendly territory. Lieutenant Mason shaded his eyes and checked his compass. "If we head due west, we'll hit the main Allied line by tomorrow night." Sergeant Cole wiped sweat from his brow. "Assuming we don't die of thirst before then." Private Harlan kicked at the sand. "Or run into another patrol." Cole glanced back at the narrow trail that had nearly been their grave. "We're not sticking around to find out." Mason nodded. "We've got the map. Now we just have to get it home." By midday, the heat was punishing. Their boots sank deep into the soft sand and their canteens were almost empty. The men took turns carrying the radio pack, a heavy, battered thing that hadn't picked up a signal in 2 days. Private Nash, the youngest, was the first to speak up. "Sir, when's the next transmission window?" Mason looked at his watch. "Top of the hour. We'll try again." They stopped under a small outcrop of rock, one of the few bits of shade for miles. Mason unpacked the radio, adjusted the antenna, and began turning the dials. Static. Then a faint voice broke through, just a whisper in the noise. "Montgomery HQ, repeat, identity, over." Cole's eyes widened. "You got them?" Mason leaned closer, his voice steady but urgent. "This is Lieutenant Mason, U.S. Army, attached to British 8th. We have critical intelligence for command. Repeat, critical intelligence, over." The static swallowed the words. Then silence. Nothing. The radio hissed, then died. Cole exhaled slowly. "So much for that." Mason stared at the dials. "The battery's nearly gone. We'll have to make it to the rendezvous on foot. By late afternoon, they reached a stretch of flat desert littered with old debris, twisted metal, burned-out trucks, and the bones of a forgotten skirmish. Cole scanned the horizon. This used to be a supply line. Germans hit it hard last month. Mason crouched beside a rusted canteen and brushed away the sand. We'll rest here, use what we can salvage. The men spread out, scavenging through the remains. Nash found a crate of dry biscuits. Harlan pulled an old jerry can from the wreckage, empty but still good for carrying water if they found any. Then Private Santos, quiet until now, called out, "Sir, over here!" They followed his voice and found him kneeling beside a buried object, a half-sunk German truck. Inside, wedged under the seat, was a folded piece of paper. Mason opened it carefully. It was a map. German markings, grid references, and a date, October 24th, 1942. Cole frowned. That's 2 days from now. Mason's eyes widened. Look here, these arrows. Troop movements. They're planning to reinforce the northern flank. Cole cursed under his breath. That's exactly where Montgomery plans to hit. If we don't get this to command, our entire offensive could walk right into them. Mason folded the map and slipped it into his case beside his own. Then we have 2 maps to deliver now. Night fell quickly. The desert cooled, and the men built a small, hidden fire using scraps of wood from the wreck. They ate in silence. The stars overhead stretched forever, sharp and bright. Nash poked the fire with a stick. "You think anyone will remember us, sir, if we don't make it?" Mason smiled faintly. "If we don't make it, they'll never even know we were here." Cole looked up from his ration tin. "Then we make it." The next morning they marched again. The terrain began to change. The dunes gave way to patches of dry grass and scattered rocks. Then, in the distance, Mason saw movement. A column of dust. Vehicles. He dropped to one knee and raised his binoculars. "German patrol, half-track and 2 trucks, coming straight toward us." Cole hissed. "We can't outrun them in open sand." Mason scanned the area. To the south, the ground sloped downward, a dry basin surrounded by low ridges. He pointed. "There. We'll dig in and wait until they pass." They sprinted toward the basin and threw themselves behind the rocks. Dust clouds grew larger, engines growling, tires grinding over sand. The trucks passed barely 50 yards away. Through his binoculars, Mason saw the soldiers, sunburned, armed, and laughing. One of them tossed a cigarette from the truck. Cole whispered, "If they stop to check." "They won't," Mason interrupted. "They think this desert is empty." The trucks rolled past. The sound faded. Cole let out a slow breath. That was too close. When the danger passed, Mason climbed to the ridge to get his bearings. From up there, he could see faint shapes far to the west, the shimmer of metal, maybe the edge of the Allied supply lines. He smiled. "We're close." But his smile faded as he looked down. In the sand below, the patrol's tire tracks ran directly through the basin they had just used as cover. The wind had not yet erased them. "If another German unit comes this way," he murmured, "they'll know someone's been here." Cole joined him, following his gaze. "Then let's leave them a story they'll believe." That night, by the dim light of the moon, they went to work. They used the butt of their rifles to carve patterns in the sand. Boot prints, tire tracks, drag marks. Mason instructed them carefully. "Make it look like a small convoy passed through," he said. 2 trucks, one heading east. They'll think it was one of their own units." For hours they worked silently, disguising every trace of their presence. When they finished, Mason climbed a nearby dune and looked back. Under the moonlight, it looked perfect. Just another forgotten path in the vast emptiness of the desert. Cole joined him. You think it'll hold? Mason smiled faintly. Long enough for us to get out. By dawn, they reached a dry ridge overlooking the Allied perimeter. Far below, faint smoke trails rose from the British artillery camps. Mason felt a surge of relief. We're almost home. Cole looked through his binoculars. Careful. Germans have scouts everywhere this close to the line. They moved slowly, weaving between rocky gullies. At the bottom of one, they found what they'd prayed for, a shallow spring trickling from a crack in the rock. Nash whooped with joy. Water! The men filled their canteens, laughing for the first time in days. Mason drank deeply, then looked west again. The map case hung from his shoulder, the weight of 2 wars inside it. He whispered, "We're going to make it." But fate wasn't done testing them. As they climbed the last ridge before the Allied outposts, the wind shifted, bringing with it the faint sound of engines. Cole froze. They're back. German patrols, coming from the north this time. Mason looked around desperately. There was nowhere to hide. Then his eyes fell on the vast open plain ahead, its surface rippled by the wind. "The sand," he said suddenly. "We can use the sand." Cole frowned. "What?" "Help me," Mason said, pulling out his compass. "We'll leave a message, one they can't erase." He dropped to his knees and began dragging lines into the sand with his boots, large and sweeping. The others joined in, confused, but following orders. After 15 minutes, they stepped back. The wind blew around them, carrying dust across the words. But from the sky, from a reconnaissance plane or an Allied lookout, the message would be clear. "Safe pass found. Move west." Cole looked at the letters, each one 20 feet wide. "You think anyone will see it?" Mason smiled. "I think they already have." Narrator's closing lines. In a world at war, sometimes the simplest tools, a compass, a map, a line in the sand, could tip the balance of victory. 6 men alone in the desert turned from deserters into messengers of fate. Their footprints would vanish by morning, but the message they left behind would guide thousands. October 23, 1942, the Western Desert, near El Alamein. The first light of dawn spilled across the desert like fire over gold. The 6 men lay hidden beneath a rocky ridge, sand caked in their clothes, rifles across their chests. For the first time in days, they could see signs of the Allied front. Faint flashes of artillery in the far distance. Lieutenant Mason stirred awake, the map case still clutched to his chest. He blinked against the bright horizon and whispered, "We made it." Sergeant Cole sat up beside him. "Not yet. We're still behind the German line. One mistake and we'll be done before breakfast." The desert stretched endlessly between them and safety. Somewhere out there, patrols still prowled the dunes, and the wind carried more than just sand. They began walking west, keeping to the shallow gullies and dry riverbeds. Their boots dragged through the dust, leaving faint trails that the wind quickly erased. Private Nash, the youngest, pointed toward the distant smoke. "Is that ours, sir?" Mason nodded. "That's Alamein, the main British position. We're about 15 miles out." 15 miles, Nash muttered. "Might as well be 1,000. Cole clapped him on the shoulder. "Keep moving. You can complain all you want when we're back in camp." By midday, the heat returned like a hammer. The air shimmered, the horizon danced with mirages. They moved slower now, conserving strength. At one point, Harlan stumbled and fell to his knees. "Can't breathe." Santos lifted him up. "You're fine, soldier. Just keep your head up." Cole handed Harlan his canteen. "Small sips. You'll live." Mason glanced at the compass, then at the sky. "We're drifting too far north. Just 3 degrees left. If we cut straight west, we'll hit the old supply road. The one the Brits abandoned? Nash asked. Mason nodded. That's the one. It'll take us right into friendly lines, and if the Germans haven't found it first. An hour later, they reached it, a faint, broken path half buried under years of drifting sand. Rusted shell casings and the remains of tire tracks marked the way. Cole crouched, brushing sand off the ground. Looks like no one's been here in weeks. Good, Mason said. That means we might just slip through unnoticed. They followed the road for miles, the sound of distant artillery growing louder. Occasionally, they passed shattered wrecks, burned-out trucks, pieces of uniforms, helmets half buried in sand. Every object whispered of those who hadn't made it. By late afternoon, they saw movement ahead, the glint of sunlight off metal. Cole raised his binoculars. 2 vehicles, half-track and a car, axis markings. Patrol? Mason asked. Looks like officers, Cole replied. We can't go around them. Too much open ground. Mason thought for a moment. Then we wait until they stop. They crept behind a cluster of rocks lying still as the vehicles drew closer. Dust rose behind them like a golden cloud. The half-track slowed, stopping near a small ridge. 2 German soldiers jumped out, scanning the horizon. Cole whispered. They're setting up a lookout. Then they'll spot us if we move, Mason said quietly. The 6 men waited, the minutes stretching like hours. Sweat trickled down their necks. The Germans smoked and talked, their rifles slung loosely. Finally, as the sun began to dip, the half-track started moving again, heading north. The car followed. Cole let out a slow breath. They're gone. Let's not wait for them to come back, Mason said. They walked until nightfall, the moon rising over the dunes. The air turned cold, almost cruelly so after the day's heat. When they finally stopped, it was on a small ridge overlooking the western plain. From here, they could see flashes of light, distant artillery shells exploding miles away. That's Alamein, Mason whispered. That's the front. Harlan laughed quietly. We actually did it? Cole smiled. Don't celebrate yet. We're still in no man's land. Mason unfolded the map, checking their position by starlight. We'll make for that cluster of lights by dawn. Should be an Allied signal station. Nash looked at him. And if it's not? Then we improvise, Mason said simply. They took turns keeping watch through the night. The desert was quiet, but in the distance, the war murmured, low thunder from the guns, a faint drone of aircraft, the heartbeat of a world at war. Cole sat beside Mason, who was still marking notes in his journal. You ever wonder, Cole said, why a man who draws maps ends up in a place like this? Mason smiled faintly. I thought the same thing about you. You could have been anything, a teacher maybe. Instead, you're babysitting a bunch of half-dead soldiers in the desert. Cole chuckled softly. Yeah, well, someone has to keep you alive. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind. Mason finally spoke. We're close, Cole. I can feel it. Once command sees what's in this case, they'll change the whole battle plan. Maybe we'll even get home early. Cole looked toward the horizon. Just make sure we get there, Lieutenant. At dawn, they began their final march. The desert here was different, packed harder, streaked with gravel and salt. Ahead, the faint outlines of trenches and barbed wire glimmered in the morning haze. Cole raised his binoculars. British positions, all right. Looks like an outpost. They waved a piece of cloth tied to a rifle and began walking toward it. Within minutes, figures appeared on the ridge, soldiers in khaki, rifles raised. "Hold your fire!" Mason shouted. "Allied soldiers!" a voice called back, sharp and wary. "Identify yourselves." "Lieutenant David Mason, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We've got intelligence for command." There was a pause. Then, slowly, the British soldiers lowered their weapons. One of them, a young corporal, ran forward. "Sir, you'd better come quick. HQ's been looking for you for days." Mason smiled. "Tell them we brought a gift." Inside the command tent, Mason spread his maps across the table before a group of stunned officers. The markings were precise, the pass detailed perfectly. "This route," he explained, "runs straight through the mountains north of Katara. If you move a flanking force through here, you'll cut Rommel's line in half." The senior officer leaned forward. "Are you certain of these coordinates?" Mason nodded. "We saw it ourselves. It's undefended." The officer exchanged glances with his aide. "If this is accurate, Lieutenant, you may have just handed us the key to victory." Outside the tent, Cole and the others sat in the sand, exhausted but smiling. Harlan leaned back, staring at the sky. "So this is what it feels like to change the world?" Cole smirked. "Feels more like my legs are about to fall off." Nash laughed. "You think they'll tell the story someday, about us?" Cole looked toward the horizon where the sun was rising over the battlefield. "If they win this fight, they'll remember everything." That night, the first Allied divisions began to move. Under the cover of darkness, convoys rolled toward the newly discovered pass, guided by Mason's map, by the message in the sand, by the courage of 6 lost men who refused to give up. The real battle for El Alamein was about to begin. Narrators closing lines. Sometimes victory doesn't begin with generals or armies, but with the lost, the desperate, and the forgotten. In the endless desert, 6 men carried a map and a hope. By the time the sun rose over El Alamein, their footprints were gone, but their mark on history would remain forever. October 24th, 1942, El Alamein, Egypt. The morning of October 24th began with silence, the kind of silence that only exists before chaos. The desert was still, its surface painted gold by the rising sun. From the cliffs above, the British Eighth Army stretched in a long line, hidden beneath camouflage nets and dust-colored tents. Lieutenant Mason stood among them, his boots sinking slightly into the sand. The map he'd drawn, the one that showed the secret pass through the mountains, now lay pinned across a planning table inside a British command tent. Around it, officers spoke in low, urgent tones. Mason felt a strange mix of pride and fear. He was a mapmaker, not a soldier meant to start a war. But tonight, his discovery would guide tens of thousands of men into battle. "Lieutenant Mason," said Colonel Harding, the British officer overseeing the operation, "you've done remarkable work. The pass you found will be our key strike point." He tapped the map. "Our main line will attack here, Rommel IS strongest defenses, while a smaller armored force moves through your pass at dawn. They'll hit the German flank before they even realize what's happening." Mason nodded. "It's narrow terrain. You'll need to move fast before they can counterattack." Harding smiled grimly. "Speed, Lieutenant, is the one thing we have left." Outside, Mason found Sergeant Cole and the others waiting by a supply truck. They'd been given clean uniforms, warm food, and a chance to rest, though none of them had really slept. Cole raised an eyebrow. "So what's the plan, Lieutenant? Are we finally going home?" "Not yet," Mason said quietly. "They're using the pass tonight. We're to help guide the tanks through it." Harlan groaned. "We just got out of there." Mason smiled faintly. "Looks like we're going back." Cole shrugged. "Then I guess we'll make sure they don't get lost." As night fell, the desert began to come alive. Engines rumbled in the darkness. Tank columns rolled forward, their lights blacked out, their crews silent. The moon was half hidden behind drifting clouds, casting the sand in silver and shadow. Mason and his small team rode in the lead jeep, headlights dimmed, following the faint outline of the path they had discovered days ago. Cole leaned out, scanning the dunes. "Hard to believe this little road might win a whole battle." Mason gripped the steering wheel. "It's not the road, it's what comes after." Behind them, the long line of armored vehicles followed like ghosts, engines humming, tracks crunching softly over the sand. They reached the entrance to the pass near midnight. It was narrower than Mason remembered, flanked by steep cliffs and scattered rocks. The wind whistled through it like a warning. A British officer on a motorcycle pulled alongside their jeep. "Lieutenant Mason?" "Yes," Mason replied. "You lead the first squadron through. The rest will follow your trail. Once you're clear, signal with a flare." "Understood," Cole muttered. "No pressure." The convoy began to move. One by one, the tanks disappeared into the narrow pass, their treads grinding over rock and gravel. The sound echoed off the cliffs, deep, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. Mason rode ahead with a flashlight covered by red cloth, guiding the way. He could feel the tension in every man around him, each breath tight, every eye searching the shadows for danger. Halfway through the pass, Nash whispered, "Sir, do you hear that?" A low rumble, distant at first, began to grow louder, the unmistakable growl of engines approaching from the north. Cole cursed under his breath. "Patrols!" Mason turned sharply. "Keep moving! If they spot us now, the entire plan's lost." Suddenly a flare shot into the sky, bright white against the darkness. The Germans had seen movement. Within seconds, gunfire erupted from the ridge. Tracer rounds streaked through the air. The echo of machine guns bounced off the canyon walls. "Get those tanks moving!" Mason shouted. "Go, go, go!" Cole and Santos returned fire from behind the jeep, trying to suppress the German position. The tanks ahead roared to life, breaking through the narrow exit of the pass. Mason grabbed the flare gun from his belt and fired into the air, a single red streak signaling success. Then the night exploded. Shells crashed into the cliffs, sending rocks tumbling down. A tank near the entrance was hit, its side bursting into flame. "Keep going!" Cole shouted, pulling Nash toward cover. "Don't stop!" Mason ducked behind a boulder, clutching his radio. "This is Mason to Harding!" "We're under fire. Germans in the ridge above the pass. The column's through, but we're pinned." Static answered. Then a calm British voice. "Hold position. Reinforcements inbound. You've done your job, Lieutenant." Mason looked at his men. "You heard him. Hold the line." The firefight lasted for nearly half an hour. The Germans tried to advance down the slope, but the Allied tanks, now positioned beyond the pass, turned their guns back toward the cliffs. The thunder of their cannons rolled across the desert, each blast lighting up the night sky. The ridge erupted under the bombardment. When the smoke cleared, the German patrol was gone. Cole leaned against the rock, breathing hard. "Well, that was one way to announce our arrival." Mason smiled weakly. "At least they know we're serious." By dawn, the main offensive had begun. From their vantage point, Mason and his men could see the horizon flash with constant explosions. The roar of artillery filled the air. Harding's voice came through the radio. "Mason, your pass is open. Our flank force is moving. Rommel's caught by surprise. He's pulling units north to defend Calais." Mason froze. "Calais?" "Yes," Harding replied. "He thinks the main attack's elsewhere. Your deception's complete." Mason smiled. "Then maybe this will be the turning point." Hours later, as the sun burned high, British and Allied forces surged through the desert. Tank tracks carved deep scars in the sand. Smoke billowed from the horizon. The Battle of El Alamein had begun, one of the largest clashes of the war. And it had started here, through a narrow pass no one had noticed before. Mason watched the columns move, exhaustion and pride mixing in his chest. Cole stood beside him, eyes on the distant battlefield. "You know," Cole said softly, "for a bunch of deserters, we didn't do too bad." Mason laughed quietly. "No, we didn't." As night fell again, the desert glowed with fire and thunder. The men lay on the ridge, listening to the rumble of history unfolding below. Mason looked up at the stars. "All this," he whispered, "because a truck broke down in the middle of nowhere." Cole nodded. "Sometimes the world changes by accident." Mason smiled faintly. "Or maybe by design." The Battle of El Alamein marked the beginning of the end for Axis forces in North Africa. It was a victory born not only of generals and grand strategies, but of luck, courage, and a single road through the desert. And somewhere among the dunes, the men who found that road watched in silence, knowing they had changed the course of the war. November 5th, 1942, the Western Desert, Egypt. The desert was quiet again. The thunder of battle had faded into the distance, replaced by a wind that whispered softly through the dunes. The once burning horizon now carried a pale orange light, the dawn after the storm. Lieutenant Mason stood on a low ridge overlooking the battlefield. Smoke still rose from wrecked tanks below, scattered across the sand like toys left behind by a careless child. The air smelled of oil and dust. Somewhere far off, a single engine coughed to life and went silent again. He didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The Battle of El Alamein was over. The Allies had won. Sergeant Cole climbed the ridge, limping slightly, his uniform torn but his eyes bright. "You're up early, Lieutenant. I thought you'd be asleep for a week." Mason smiled faintly. "Couldn't sleep. The quiet feels strange after all that noise." Cole nodded, looking out at the field. "Hard to believe we made it out of that alive. You think it's really over?" "For now," Mason said softly. "But the war's not done yet. This is just one chapter." Cole sighed. "Then I'll take the quiet while it lasts." Down below, small groups of soldiers moved between the burned-out wrecks, tending to the wounded and gathering what they could. British medics knelt beside German soldiers, treating them with the same steady hands. The war had paused here for a moment, a strange peace among the wreckage. Mason and Cole walked down the slope toward their camp. They passed a group of men sitting by a truck, eating from tin cans, their faces hollow but calm. One of them, Private Nash, raised a hand in greeting. "Morning, sir," Nash said. "Harding's looking for you." Mason frowned. "What for?" "He said it's about a commendation or something. Sounded serious." Cole chuckled. "Well, look at that. The deserters get medals now." Inside the command tent, Colonel Harding sat at a folding table, surrounded by maps marked with red and blue pins. He looked up as Mason entered. "Lieutenant," Harding said warmly, rising to his feet, "you've done something extraordinary. That pass you found, it changed everything. Rommel's line collapsed faster than anyone expected. The victory belongs as much to you as to any general." Mason hesitated. "With respect, sir, it wasn't just me. My men—" Harding held up a hand. "I know, and I've made sure their names are on the list, too." He paused. "But tell me something, Mason, and you're not even combat trained, are you?" "No, sir," Mason admitted. "I was a cartographer. My truck broke down in the wrong place at the right time." Harding smiled. "History's full of accidents like that." He reached into his coat and handed Mason a small envelope. Inside was a simple letter, a commendation for distinguished service. Mason stared at it for a long time. "Thank you, sir." Harding nodded. "You've earned it. Now go get some rest. You've done your part." That night, the men sat around a small fire outside the camp. The stars glittered above, cold and sharp against the black sky. Cole poured a little tea into a dented tin cup and passed it to Mason. "To the mapmaker who saved the desert," he said, with a grin. Mason chuckled. "And to the sergeant who didn't shoot me when I got us lost." The group laughed quietly. For the first time in weeks, it wasn't the laughter of relief or madness. It was real. As the flames flickered low, Mason looked out toward the horizon, where faint lights still glowed from the distant front. "You ever wonder," he said softly, "how many times something like this has happened? How many battles turned because of luck or timing or someone making the right mistake?" Cole shrugged. "Or maybe that is what war really is, a collection of mistakes that ended up in the right order." Mason smiled. "Maybe so." He pulled the map case from his pack, the same one he'd carried since the beginning, and unfolded the chart of the desert. The pass was marked there, a thin black line cutting through the mountains. He took out a pencil and added one last note beside it: "The Road of the Forgotten." Cole watched him. "You naming it after us?" Mason nodded. "After all the people who didn't mean to be here, but were." Days later, the squad was ordered back to Cairo. The war moved west, chasing the retreating German army into Tunisia. Their truck rattled along the long desert road, the same road that had once stranded them. Now it was lined with the wrecks of abandoned vehicles, the skeletons of the campaign they'd helped turn. Nash leaned over from the back seat. "What do you think happens to us now?" Cole grinned. "We get new orders, new mistakes, new deserts to cross." Mason smiled quietly. "And maybe, if we're lucky, a way home." As the sun dipped below the dunes, the landscape turned gold once more, the same color it had been the day they'd first gotten lost. The truck rolled on, its tires kicking up small clouds of dust that hung in the air like ghosts. In the distance, the wind carried faint echoes. The sound of explosions long faded, voices shouting commands, engines roaring through the sand. War had moved on, but its echoes stayed behind, drifting through the empty desert like memories that refused to die. When night fell, they made camp under the open sky. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the sand. Mason sat apart, writing in a small notebook by the firelight. Cole walked over and sat beside him. "Still mapping things?" Mason looked up, smiling. "Always." Cole peered at the page. "What's that one called?" Mason closed the book softly. "The Desert That Remembered." Cole frowned. "Bit poetic for a soldier." "I was never much of a soldier," Mason said. "But maybe that's why I saw what others didn't." Cole nodded slowly. "You know, someday people will tell this story about the lost map maker and the squad that found the road that won a battle." Mason shook his head. "If they do, I hope they remember the truth." "What truth?" "That we weren't heroes. We were just trying to find our way home." In November 1942, the Allied victory at El Alamein turned the tide of the war in North Africa. The names of generals and armies filled the history books, but far from the headlines, countless unknown men and women shaped that victory in ways history rarely records. Among them was a cartographer, a broken-down truck, and a group of soldiers who never meant to be there, yet changed the world all the same. Sometimes the smallest detour leads to the greatest destination.